Lauren, it's a glorious Monday morning. How are you?
It is indeed a glorious Monday morning here in California. Welcome, everyone. We're honing in here on the final 2 days of the COP drop, a daily live stream during COP28, hosted by the Faiths for Biodiversity Coalition and the United Religions Initiative. Every day, we've been discussing the latest developments from Dubai with a focus on nature and biodiversity. And we're learning about the amazing ways that faith and spiritual communities all around the world are working to protect and restore the environment. My name, as Gopal said, is Lauren Van Ham. I serve as the Climate Action Coordinator for the United Religions Initiative, and I'm joined by Gopal Patel, who is the co-convener for Faiths for Biodiversity Coalition. Today, we have with us again, Dan Perell with Baha'i International. How are you doing, Dan?
I'm doing very well. Happy to be back in New York, in my home. Sorry, surprise, I'm back in New York. I'm not joining from Dubai. Apologies.
When did you get back?
I returned 3 days ago, but my WhatsApp messages indicate that I haven't left at all.
Explain what that means.
I wake up every morning to, 70 messages from the different groups that I'm on and my own colleagues who are still there. So I still feel like I'm there, but I get to sleep in my own bed. So it's the best of both worlds.
Perfect. That's been our lives for the last 2 weeks. Every morning we've been waking up, Lauren and I, we've getting all these messages from Dubai. So it is nice. Well, we're literally in the final stretch now for COP28. I think they're meeting as we speak to finalize the text. The draft came out about an hour or two ago, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a bit. But firstly, just what are your big takeaways from COP? You were there for about 10 days or so in total.
Yeah, so it's complicated to say that there's a big takeaway because COP is so multidimensional now. I mean, it has exploded, especially this year, in terms of the vast number of different spaces and perspectives, and people come from all over the world for the green zone.
Mm.
Which is not even the official negotiation side. So then there's a whole other COP that's
Mm.
happening. There's like 4 or 5 or 6 different COPs that are taking place. Of course, Conference of the Parties, there's really only one set of parties. But
Right.
in terms of the activities, there's so much happening. So forgive me flattening COP down to a couple of my own thoughts. I recognize that there's a lot of other nuance and dimensions and things that could and likely should be spoken about. I'll just speak from my own reflections. A couple of things at the sort of highest level is that nothing is taboo anymore, which I think is great. I mean, there's a lot of frustration about fossil fuels and that we're not doing things fast enough. And I think that frustration is well warranted. And I think it's, I appreciate all the debate that's ongoing and the impatience and all of this. But on the other hand, in terms of like looking back 5 years, 10 years, you couldn't be saying these things that are just second nature from member states, from civil society. There's this whole alliance now to get off of fossil fuel, alliance of member states to get off fossil fuels. I mean, I think it's a fantastic advance at the level of rhetoric and expectation. Now, of course, action lags. You first have to start with this rhetorical dimension, this thought advancement, and action sort of comes later. But I'm heartened by that dimension in terms of the advancement of the conversation. Another thing that I thought was really great this year was the way that many of the offsite spaces were engineered to ensure that like-minded but different actors were in the same location. So I spoke quite a bit with some of the food systems people, and they were all right next to each other. I mean, some were vegetarian, vegan types, and some were, new farming types, and some were food systems types, but they're all in the same sort of corner and they're able to interact. They never, I mean, I don't know. I doubt that they spent that much time at the negotiations, but the connections that they were able to make, the partnerships they were able to make, the relationships they could reinforce, that all is really fantastic. I mean, I don't know in terms of its impact on the negotiations, minimal. In terms of its impact on people's lives, actually, it could be quite significant. I mean, you have some significant actors who are all in the same space together. The last thing I'll say, and I referenced it a little bit with this idea of the fair. It is a big climate fair. I mean, I think I said earlier it was Climate Disney. And it's not really to denigrate what it is. I don't mean to cheapen it. I mean, Disney's a legit thing. Ask my children. But to say it's like this huge space and everybody's there and you go to your own little world and you know, it's like, what is it, Tomorrowland and all of this stuff. It exists there in a way. But on the other hand, one of the challenges when you have a fire hose of stuff is that you always feel like you're in the wrong place. There's always somewhere else to be. There's always some other meeting to attend, someone else to listen to. And then even when you're in a side event, it's so poorly attended because people go there to speak. Not very many people go there to listen. And I think that there has to be a different way that we can engage in discourse. We hosted we called it an off-site event on the off day where we had 90 people come to Masdar City for a dinner conversation modeled actually after the dinner conversations, Gopal, that we did at TED this past year. And that was fascinating and lovely because it was flat. You know, people were at a table, you had senators and country representatives and NGOs, and we were at a table answering the same questions about, you know, the future and the values and all of this. And that kind of conversation I felt was really helpful. Maybe in part because it was different, but it was also different. And it made me think about, you know, what is the actual utility of event after event after event when the goal is actually to build relationships and partnerships and advance a conversation. That was way more than I expected to say. Sorry.
I was listening to every single word, Dan. I think what I'm hearing is kind of actual coalition building. Could I say that? I don't know if that feels legit, but I mean, when people are really relating, you know, it's less transactional. Like I give talk, you listen, and a little bit more, what should we do?
Yes.
What's real where you're living? That feels potentially useful. Especially as we're going into this next year. Gopal and I were just talking about this, actually, the idea that there are 3 COPs in 2024. And we certainly would be foolish to not be thinking about how this all weaves together in a substantive contribution, right? What are your thoughts about that, Dan?
I mean, I think that's true. It's so difficult. I mean, one of the other dimensions to this is that while I say that these like-minded coalitions were sort of near each other, there are 1,000 of them. I mean, there's food, there's energy, there's private sector, there's fossil fuels. Like you name the grouping, not to mention the different human types, youth and women and indigenous, and like you have so many different categories in academia, you name it. It's really hard to find that coherence when there's such a cacophony of voices, but you need that diversity also to come to the right solutions. And I think it's a real challenge that humanity is facing. We've never had this before. We've never had such a capacity to come together across all these different constituencies in one place, you know, with a shared language, more or less. I mean, I huge asterisk because I know that there's some language challenges for many, so I don't want to, you know, gloss over that. You know, we can do it over Zoom and we can do it hybrid, and like it's amazing the type of connectivity. But what happens with more and more and more and more is that we have to develop a greater skill at finding what is actually useful and what we can set aside in order to truly find what knowledge is. So for example, a lot of people, I was frustrated by this at one event, people came and they shared these wonderful facts and wonderful information and even experience that has been built. And that's great. My question is always, well, how did you transform? How was it X and it became Y? Because I don't care what Y is. We can all do Y, but I can't impose Y on others. What we have to think about is that transformation dimension. And so I go around COP and I try to think, okay, where's the story where it was like this before and it became like that? And that is more aligned with what we need. And I think that that's one of the skills that we have to learn. It's not book reporting anymore, which we can do quite well. But what's the utility in knowing that in this village in X part of the world, they now are doing a different type of farming. That's great. I want to know, what were the policy changes? What was the transformational dimension? And what is the impact on those who historically have had challenges? Like that sort of thing is hard for us to articulate because in part, we can't measure it. You can't measure the change of heart. It's not like, oh, 14 hearts were changed in the past month. Amazing. Like that's not a thing we know how to do, but actually we know increasingly that it's not about the technical capacity or the knowledge capacity. It's about the ethical framework and the values and the heart. And that's why I think this like faith groups actually have quite a bit to add. And yet sometimes we get trapped in this same thing as well of like, let's build another coalition around this thing and let's coalesce over here and articulate all the great things we're doing. Well, that's fine. Let's talk a little bit about transformation and think about how we can encourage others to make the sacrificial, the more difficult decisions in the short run that actually pay off for humanity in the long run.
And that transformation of hearts, going back to what you were saying about how this COP is like a fairground, there's different ways we can describe it. And like yourself, I've been to many COPs and I've certainly seen that evolution as well. And it feels like in many ways, hearts and minds have been transformed over a number of years now, if the COP is a reflection of that. Maybe not in the negotiating room, but we see it a bit there, but definitely in the civil society spaces, like in the green zone and all the pavilions. And so I don't want to impose this upon you, Dan, but I'm wondering, from what I've been hearing and seeing from the comfort of my apartment here in New York, is that the train has left the station. We're moving in the right direction. Member states are maybe a bit slower to move than we would like, but the direction of travel is there. It's really just a question of how fast are we moving, and can we move fast enough to avoid the worst impacts of climate change? How does that feel like to you in terms of an assessment?
I think it's close.
Okay.
I'm going to maybe take the analogy too far, and I'm trying to work it as I vamp here. But I think that the train has left the station being pulled by horses. That's fine. Like you're going the right way. You'll get there, but maybe not fast enough. We got to change that engine a little bit.
Sure.
We need something a little bit stronger to motivate us because there's this common refrain, and it's maybe cliche to demean it, but you can't just depend on the invisible hand and the market forces to get us there. And that seems to be what we're trying to do, is tailor the market, which is inherently self-interested, profit motivated, tailor that and apply it to this. Well, I feel like you can get somewhere. Like you can have horses pull that train, but it's not going to get us there fast enough and far enough. There was one intervention that really struck me of a guy who's speaking about economic values misalignment. He said, in economic valuation, there's this thing of like diminishing futures, where valuations of products in the future are worth much less than those in the present. And he said that's actually super perverse when you think about it. Like it makes sense logically from a corporate standpoint, because a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush, as they say. But he said, I would die for my children and my grandchildren. I would sacrifice everything for them. And yet with that futures economic thinking where the value is diminished, we are saying that they are worth less. And far enough into the future, they're worthless. It's zero. So we're saying that the future is worth zero. And if that's sort of the economic model that we're using, then obviously it's not going to get us to the changes we need. So yes, the train has left the station. Things are moving. I just think we're going to have to do a little bit of that ship of Theseus thing where we replace the whole thing as we're going. I can't remember whose ship it is, but you know the guy I'm talking about. At the end, it's a different ship entirely.
I don't think I know that reference, but maybe you can send it over to me later. So what are your thoughts then? And I appreciate you may not have had much time to digest and read the commentary that's coming out of Dubai right now in terms of the current draft text. It seems like it's not made, no one is happy with it, which is always the case in these multilateral spaces. But I think the key thing is that we've seen come out is that there's no mention of a phase down or a phase out of fossil fuels, although I believe fossil fuels are mentioned for the first time, but that the phase down, phase out is not there, but it says that fossil fuels well, we need to move to a net zero. We need to move to net zero by 2050. But it doesn't say exactly how, or doesn't prescribe too much. Again, I'm just reading it in the last hours. It's been coming out of Dubai. I'm wondering, Dan, if you've had a chance to look at it or see any commentary around it and any thoughts you have on that.
I mean, I've seen a couple of things. The problem is that at least for me, because I'm not there and I'm not in the room, it's hard for me to know what's true. So I clicked on a couple of those links, and I found that actually 3 paragraphs later, it did call for a fossil fuel phase out. Now maybe that's been stricken, and like that's all what it is.
Right.
And I think we know that there are going to be those who are trying to maintain the status quo. I think about it, and if we just got off fossil fuels right now, what would the impacts be on the billions of people who are reliant upon them? And I'm not saying that anybody is suggesting that we do it right now, but it's hard to envision, like without a just transition plan, it's really hard to envision what it will look like. I think it's got to be there. Like obviously we know. Well, I read this funny little quip that the Stone Age didn't end because we ran out of stone. Like the fossil fuel age won't end because we run out of fossil fuels. Like we make it a technological advance, goes the argument. And we may or may not, we're doing certain things and we're finding problems with them. Like if you have so much solar power that now energy like generates $0 because there's so much, well, what's going to happen to an energy company? What's going to happen to their employees? And I'm not saying that I have like all the answers. I get maybe more than many in civil society would want to admit that it's more complicated than just putting a paragraph in a resolution. I think it's important. I don't want to discount it. But maybe sometimes we put so much stock in whether a paragraph is in there that it ends up becoming a wedge between us and the solutions because we're so busy making an enemy out of the other. And I don't know. I don't want this to become like, oh, Dan is ignorant of fossil fuels and the negative impacts they have. I get it. And I think it would be better if we could all just say the thing that we know to be true, which is that we have to get off of fossil fuels and soon, and we should be directing much of our energy to it. But I do see also how that could be scary to the communities that are totally reliant upon it for their livelihoods. And I don't know. I think it's so easy to create an enemy out of the other. And I wonder what it would look like to try and offer solutions rather than argue about a paragraph in a document that's going to be renegotiated in 12 months anyway. Like how is this the best use of our time, energy, and wisdom? I don't know. It's a question. It's not like a position. So again, I just want to be very careful about that.
I'm really struck, Dan, by your mention of, well, the just transition would have to be in place in order for this end of fossil fuels to actually arrive. And I'm also struck by your mention of the gentleman who was putting value on his children and his grandchildren. And I'm thinking about the ways that our faith groups, our spiritual communities can start to be better students of how the X becomes a Y. What was it that happened right here that allowed this group of people to flourish in a way that they previously had not? That is something that not just that now they're flourishing, but all of those other ingredients that you sort of lifted up. Is there anything, I know we're almost at our time here, but is there a story from Baha'i International? Is there a community that you feel has done that well?
Let me provide an example. And it may not be the thing that people love to hear because it's actually another process. But there are Baha'is in Australia, and I was just chatting about this morning with some colleagues in Australia who put on a series of consultations all over the country about essentially shared societies, coexistence, all of this stuff. And it was really lovely. And now they have like an annual conference thinking about the future of Australia and how they can live in a shared society and what that would look like. And there were government institutions that began to turn to the Baha'i community to say, what is it that you're doing here? And how is it having such a profound impact? They said, you take a positive spin on this idea of like negative rights. We always speak about the negative, like ending this bad thing, and you're speaking about the positive, promoting this good thing. How are you doing this differently, and why? And so then the Baha'i spoke to them. There are a couple of small things that were different. Like one of them is this governmental organization would come in with a document that then everybody would edit. Whereas the Baha'is don't come in with a document. They come in with nothing, and they come in and they share perspectives. Another one is a government institution likes to speak to groups on their own. So all the migrants are together, the indigenous people are together, the women are together, the youth, and they like that because then you can say, oh, here's the women's perspective, here's the youth perspective. Whereas the Baha'is just say, we need to have the full diversity of a community if we want to find the answer. It's not to say it's better or worse. They're different approaches. But what they were finding was that in this process that the Baha'is were engaged in, there was a lot more learning taking place across constituencies, a lot more ownership of the process because there wasn't something that was imposed upon them. And actually that government organization then took on, and I can't say what it is because I don't know if I have permission to, but that government organization then took on this approach to consultation. And they even now have a conference that they're putting together on consultation. Like, what does it look like to engage in conversation, which is different from negotiation. Like, we enter these spaces with our language, with our BATNA, like our best alternative to a negotiated outcome, like all that stuff. That's how we're taught, getting to yes, and this sort of adversarial means. Maybe it had some benefits, but maybe there are other ways that we can work that are not purely adversarial, that are actually co-creative. And that co-creative process may lead to different kinds of solutions that we wouldn't have thought of if we just come in worried about number one, but we come in worrying about humanity as a whole with an open mind and an open perspective. And also not like defending ourselves or making the other the enemy, but actually trying to learn together. And this process, sorry to make such a long-winded story, this process is profoundly replicable across all sorts of problems. The Vanuatu example I brought up before was a result of consultation. It was open consultation between the youth and the elders. And like, it doesn't matter the specific area. If the process is inclusive and open and inquisitive, then what you can get as a result is very different and hopefully more suited to the needs of that community than just an outside in or a top down or a negotiated or an adversarial approach. Yeah, and that's one of the things we're learning.
That's really, really great stuff, Dan. I thank you for that, because those couple of examples just around how we even convene a conversation is useful for people all around the world. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. Yeah, I think it just speaks to, again, how, there's been such a high level of engagement with faith groups at this COP, and a lot of the conversations we've been having on these COP drop live streams is how do we add value? How do we show up in a purposeful, meaningful way? And as you're saying, it can just be as simple as, well, how do we actually have a conversation? Who do we bring into that room? And so, it doesn't need to be all fancy and technical and high finance, to make transformative change. It can just be very basic as who sits around that table to have a conversation and how is that conducted. As always, Dan, it's a pleasure to see you. I'm glad you're back in New York safely. Any plans for the rest of the year before you break for Christmas?
I mean, the rest of the year is doing all the work that I put off in the month before COP and trying not to curse that Dan too much as this Dan is trying to do the work that he should have done.
Great. Well, Dan, good to see you, and we'll look forward to connecting again in the future.
Thanks so much. And thanks for the COP drops. They've been delightful. I've really enjoyed them. So thanks for this initiative.
Thank you.
Take good care, Dan.
You too. Bye-bye.
So the negotiations are going on, Lauren. I think by this time tomorrow, we'll have the final text. We'll have all the formal statements or press releases from all the big NGOs and civil society groups and hear what they have to say. How do you think it's going to go?
They're working on it as we speak. So we'll just send some blessings in that direction. And I definitely heard things in our conversation today about ways that we all can move the needle in the places where we live, which is great.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you for joining us, everyone. We look forward to seeing you tomorrow for the final COP drop, 11 a.m. Eastern. We'll see you then.
Take care.